Vermilion Lloydminster.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I certainly have enjoyed the discussion thus far, and I appreciate the comments that have been brought forward. And, I will tell you that, my participation in the Select Special Committee on Ethics and Accountability was an interesting experience, and one that regrettably has not been decided by this government to be extended, as was unanimously requested by committee members. But I want to make a few statements directly from the outset. First of all, the Progressive Conservative Caucus is in favor of electoral finance reform. I want to be very clear on that. And secondly, I want to make it very clear for those who perhaps have forgotten, and the record will show that we voted in favor of Bill number 1 to restrict union and corporate donations to political parties. We are also in favor of decreased contribution limits. As the member for Calgary Elbow has stated, the limits that were in place before were very high, and I don't think they were appropriate. And we were in agreement with a reduction of those limits, and that the $4,000 limit that is in the current legislation, we're, I think, in general favor of that. And we're also in favor of some mechanism for placing a limitation on spending, with the proviso that that spending limitation has to be applied fairly. And when I say applied fairly, it means it has to be applied not just to political entities, but it has to be applied to an extent to third-party advertising, and it has to be applied to entities that are not covered under the Election Finances and Contributions Disclosure Act. It also has to be applied fairly to the government. We've seen a government that has just finished spending $4.5 million promoting a climate leadership plan, which would be more than double the amount that a political party is allowed to spend in an entire election campaign. I think that is something that needs to be dealt with. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, both here in the chamber and also outside, and the member for Calgary Elbow gave, I think, a very good summary as far as the work of the committee. I will say that I don't think we're going to come to any sort of consensus here within this chamber about the work that the committee did. And I think it's more valuable for us to move forward and decide and have some debate on the legislation in front of us. To start finger-pointing and blaming as to what happened during the course of the committee discussions, I don't think is terribly productive. But I will say that I was concerned with the number of recommendations from the committee, some of which were approved unanimously by the committee, that have now been changed inexplicably in this piece of legislation coming forward. I will give you an example. The initial recommendation for the limit on campaign spending for a constituency association was $40,000 and $50,000 for certain designated northern Alberta constituencies. Now, there was some concern expressed by that, and at the next meeting, after an adjournment of the debate by the NDP committee members, quite inexplicably and quite arbitrarily, that number was increased to $70,000 and $80,000. But there was no explanation, there was no rationale given for that. In fact, it looked very much like a number picked out of thin air. But that was the new number that was recommended, and that was the number that in fact was passed by the committee. Now, quite inexplicably, that number in the legislation has been changed to $50,000. We don't know why. We haven't been explained what the rationale for that is. Furthermore, a second area that was changed was the maximum contribution, not the $4,000 part, but the part that could be given to a constituency association. Now, the previous limit was $1,000 per year. And that $1,000 per year was very practical in terms of, over the course of an election cycle, it meant that a single donor could not fund a significant portion of a campaign, especially given that the campaigns did not have a spending limit. Now, we in the committee pointed out that a $4,000 limit, even when applied to a $70,000 campaign, meant that if you had 5 relatively wealthy donors over the course of an election cycle, they could fund the entire campaign expenses. And this, of course, sent the NDP off scurrying to their back rooms to determine some way that they could correct this obvious oversight. which they even said was an oversight on their part. So now we have a situation where we don't have the limitation of $1,000 to the constituency association. They've reverted back to the $4,000 to the constituency annually, which means rather than restricting the donations allowed, they've in fact quadrupled the allowable constituency annual donation, which seems to me to run counterintuitive to getting big money out of politics. But now we're in a situation where literally, as the member for Calgary Elbow pointed out, 3 donors over the course of a 4-year election cycle could completely bankroll a $50,000 election campaign. Mr. Speaker, I think that flies in the face of the stated goal of getting big money out of politics. Many constituency associations spend a lot of time and effort engaging constituents, engaging donors in having annual or sometimes twice-a-year fundraising events that are dedicated towards building up, if you will, a campaign war chest for a political campaign. Now, basically all you really need is 3 relatively generous friends. And to me, that, I think, defeats the purpose of trying to get as many people engaged in the process as possible. I think it's a significant flaw. Now, I will give the government credit, or whoever in the government back rooms took a look at the committee's recommendation and decided to alter them, and that is that whoever that mysterious person or persons is, they did drop the rebates of 50% of campaign expenses to both parties and candidates who received 10% of the vote total. That was a good move, and I'm glad that that is not part of the current bill. Certainly that is something that was not supported by Albertans, and I would suggest that it was the single most opposed decision made by the committee during the entire time. And the final one that I've changed, and there are others, but the final major one was with regards to reporting by chief financial officers of constituency associations. We had asked that that be moved from a quarterly requirement to an annual requirement. The chief electoral officer, in fact, agrees with that because the chief electoral officer has indicated that one of the things that they spend a great deal of time with in their office is processing these quarterly returns from constituency associations, and that in his opinion it does not add to the transparency of the overall process and add to the transparency that we're trying to strive for in electoral financing. And so we agreed as a committee that that should move to annually. Now, inexplicably, it's been moved back to quarterly, and when we asked, well, why quarterly and what would that require, we were even told that the quarterly reporting would become more meaningful. I'm not entirely sure what more meaningful means, but it concerns me that it does create an onerous amount of work on constituency associations that actually have active fundraising events and have active fundraising. Now, the lack of restriction on government spending either during or before the writ period is something that I've already mentioned, and Mr. Speaker, this is a concern. Now, I asked a question to the Chief Electoral Officer during the course of things. I said, if greater restrictions are placed upon political parties, constituency associations, and other entities over which the Chief Electoral Officer has purview, will that result in more of it going to other entities? And he told me without any doubt the experience in other constituencies and other jurisdictions has been that it absolutely does drive it into other areas where it's not controlled, not monitored. And so one of the unintended consequences of putting too high a level of restriction on both spending as well as donations is that it simply forces that into areas that are no longer being monitored by the Chief Electoral Officer. We have seen that in other jurisdictions, and I don't think it is something that we want to see in Alberta. The second area that I have a tremendous amount of concern with and resulted in a rather spirited debate on September 9th, and that is this government's decision that the state should become involved in internal party affairs. And it's stunning to me that they think that's a good idea. Mr. Speaker, that is a level of overreach that everyone who loves democracy, everyone who feels that political parties should at least have the freedom to operate without interference from the state should be very concerned about. And it is a principle that is of great concern when we talk about the nomination process. The committee feels, or the NDP members of the committee felt it is important for now the government to step into an arena that it has never had any involvement with before, and that is regulating nomination contests. Mr. Speaker, this is a concern from a whole long list of reasons. The principle of doing that is wrong. It also creates a significant increase in cost in the Chief Electoral Officer's office. In Elections Alberta, he suggested on questioning that it would cost approximately $400,000 more per year. And in addition, there's a practical aspect. Nominations typically occur shortly before an election. If we have 87 constituencies, and if we say there are 4 nomination contests per constituency, and there are, say, 4 candidates running per nomination contest, this would result in over 1,000 returns having to be processed by the Chief Electoral Office and approved in the time then before the next election comes. And since many nomination contests in fact happen shortly before the writ is dropped, in some cases even after the writ is dropped, how are we to know that the Chief Electoral Officer has properly done the due diligence that is required on these nomination returns? The short answer, of course, is it can't. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this level of overreach may not even be constitutional. In 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal, in the case of Longley versus Canada, specifically dealt with this, and the quoting from the judgment, and this was read into the record by the Chief Electoral Officer, it deals with discussing the Chief Electoral Officer's restraint from involvement in political party affairs, and specifically states that any regulatory regime governing political parties must interfere as little as possible with the autonomy and internal affairs of political parties. How political parties choose their candidates, how they conduct their nomination contests is no business of the state. Once the nominee is chosen, then they become part of the overall electoral process, but how they make that decision of candidate is certainly not the purview of the state. And so, Mr. Speaker, at this time, I would like to move an amendment, and I would ask the pages to come and get the amendment from me. I have the requisite number of copies, and the original is on top for the clerk's table. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that there needs to be some additional work done on this bill. Electoral financing is very important, and we did achieve some measure of agreement on a lot of different aspects of this, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And in that regard, Mr. Speaker, it's regrettable that the Ethics and Accountability Committee was not chosen to be reconstituted in some way, but we do have other committees that can take a look at this. And so with that in mind, I'd like to read into the record that I move that the motion for second reading on Bill 35, the Fair Elections Financing Act, be amended by deleting all of the words after that and substituting the following. Bill 35, the Fair Elections Financing Act, be not now read a second time, but that the subject matter of the bill be referred to the Standing Committee on Families and Communities in accordance with Standing Order 74, Subclause 2. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's my statement, and I put forward that there is still a great deal of work to be done here, and that it is important that the committee, a new committee in this case, take the opportunity to review some of the deliberations that were taken by this Ethics and Accountability Committee. And I think this referral motion would give them the opportunity to do that. I think that it's important that as we discuss electoral financing, we look at some of the changes that were made from the time that the committee that spent literally hours and hours and hours on this to some back room, some mysterious person who has decided to change those recommendations. That, to me, is a concern, how those changes can be made. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is with that that I would encourage all members of the chamber to support this referral motion, and I certainly look forward to the debate both on the referral motion and on Bill 35 in general. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.